Now we want to talk about through the roof leadership. If you see this picture, please forgive the Catholic Jesus in the picture. This is what AI gave me when I said, please show me what it might have looked like when four people broke through a roof, as explained in the book of Mark, chapter 2. And so I would love to just start us off with a very simple question. I'd love for everybody to take a moment and observe this picture. We're going to talk today more about how to develop leaders who clear the way for those in need. Do you know what I started thinking when I saw this picture? I started thinking, where is the owner of this house? And what in the world is that person thinking? Right? This man had a hole dug through his roof. And I can't imagine that our pastors or boards want to see this kind of destruction um, in our churches. And yet, this is exactly part of the point of this story is that we have to get creative, that helping the needy can be expensive, it can be messy, right? Nobody said mess. Nobody said expense. I think that's because we all have such um, genuine hearts of love for those in need, or we wouldn't be on this call tonight, right? But but I think the important thing here is that the moral of this story in the scripture, anyway, is that God was pleased. God's will was that this man be brought to the feet of Jesus, and he was okay with the mess, and he was okay with the cost. Um, God the Father, for sake of the illustration, owns the house, and his heart is as ours is tonight. Let them in, whatever it takes. So here's where we come in, and we want to talk more about how. But I am going to start with a premise that not everyone necessarily has started with yet. And I just saw Barbara's contribution, not letting the world hold them back from reaching Jesus. Absolutely. Absolutely. It reminds us of the disciples who tried to hold the children back when they wanted to come to Jesus. And in a sense, they are needy because they can't get into our churches if their parents don't bring them. And that's a conversation for another day. I know Sandy's had all kinds of wonderful children's ministry webinars. So we'll tackle that one another day. But for today, what we have to start with, I believe, is acknowledging that there are some people in our community missing from our churches. Before we dive too deeply into the research that proves this and what can be done about it, I want to give you the one takeaway that I hope you will write down. And if you remember nothing else from this evening, you remember this one word. The one essential key to ensuring access to the gospel for people with disabilities is relationship. Contrary to popular belief, the greatest barriers people with disabilities face in God's house and accessing the gospel, they're not physical, they are relational. Now, we've made a lot of progress in improving buildings, and I think that that's important to celebrate. Thanks to the ADA and lots of wonderful families willing to give, willing to advocate, a lot of our buildings have become more accessible. A lot of our other spaces where we meet to minister and serve together are accessible. But most people with disabilities have reported these four things as their deepest barriers. And so, again, if you're taking notes, this is something that you want to remember. Number one, social isolation. People with disabilities report struggling far more from feeling unseen, even after they've gained access to a building, or disconnected, even after they've been there for a while. Secondly, there's a fatigue that is hard for those of us who are typical to relate to. And it comes from navigating barriers everywhere they go every day. The third thing that we heard was uncertainty about being welcomed without being a burden. I had a coworker when I was a special education teacher at Windsor High School for our life skills and resource programs. And one of the coworkers of mine, Tanya, uses a wheelchair. And very often she spent more of her energy apologizing for inconveniencing the people around her than actually trying to do the job that she was there to do. Lastly, and this is a big one that is so frequently overlooked, people with disabilities struggle from not having opportunities to shape their community. They don't feel they are often given a voice in any decision making. They're not invited to leadership meetings or on boards, generally speaking, or asked about how the accessibility activities of a church um, might be adjusted to include or support them in ways that haven't already been thought of. So, these are just some very important barriers to keep in mind, in addition to the physical barriers we all have heard about so often. Research shows that not only do people with disabilities struggle with accessibility in everyday life and in the world, but it happens very often in God's house without those in charge even being aware of it. I'm going to give you a statistic soon that talks more about that. But what I want to do first is just continue on with, oh, I went too far, um, with this idea of relationship. So the answer to how does a church become more accessible is almost never just equipment, funds, or programs. The answer is relationship. How can we, as senior leaders, create more space and time for relationships to be built for our congregations and people with disabilities? Um, Relationship is how Jesus saved us, and relationship is how discipleship works. And so that has to be our first step. In addition to the relational barriers we discussed earlier, there are physical barriers. Let's talk about how that shows up very often in our communities today and how that number may actually be growing without our knowledge. So, you might see from the slide that I'm sharing right now, there is a rising number of people with identified disabilities. 27% of Americans live with a disability that limits their basic daily activity. That is a quarter of people in our communities. Again, the number is rising. 12% or 1 in 10 of US adults have a mobility disability with serious difficulty walking or climbing any stairs. Now, one of the biggest reasons for that, does anybody want to put a guess into the chat? It's sort of a social trend that we all know has been happening. It's the boomers, right? I'm close. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm almost there. There is this whole generation, large generation of people who, as they age, have more needs. And we don't typically think of these as people with disabilities, but the truth is the number of people getting older and the percentage of population that is older is getting larger. It's also due to technology advances and advances in medicine and science. People are just able to live longer. And thank God, because if they have not yet met Jesus, we want more time with them if they can connect with us. I hear you, Barbara. And truly, we held a women's breakfast in our church offices, which again are on the second floor of the building we rent out. Why? Because the second floor is less expensive. And a lot of churches think that that's a great way to save some money. Unfortunately, they don't realize they're alienating people by doing that if the building is not handicap accessible. But the gist here is let's be proactive and be prepared because this information is readily available, and we're not surprised by it, but are we acting on it? All right, let's see next slide. So the average life expectancy in 1925 was 58 years. In 2025, the average life expectancy is 78 years. And again, this number is rising. And if we look at the entire United States, the median age of every US state, this is a fascinating map. This is from 2022. But the darkest states are the ones with the oldest average age. And sure enough, New England wins by a lot, um, except for one small county in Florida, which makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of snowbirds, excuse me, who leave New England to head down south for the winter, right, with the birds, right? But the truth is, this is a trend that we as the church can be aware of and prepare for. And God is not surprised. God knows what's happening on the earth, and He wants to make a way, even where there seems to be no way. The rising number of people with disabilities goes beyond what we see on the outside. All right, so I want to talk for a second about hidden disabilities. 40% of people with physical disabilities suffer from hidden mental health difficulties. And if we're being honest, this is often the more difficult issue when serving people with disabilities. We can understand the tangibles of getting a ramp, providing parking, but to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of a person who is tired, who is frustrated, and who desperately just wants to be loved like everyone else, wants an opportunity to give, to serve, to learn, to grow, to be discipled, to disciple others, to lead in God's house, to preach, to do whatever it is that God has put on their hearts to do, and to experience so many barriers. The patience and the kindness that God has asked us to show is going to get us much further very often than just the physical activities that we have in our budget. Thank you. I see some comments in the chat, so I'll just take a moment to check in on those. David says he doesn't have mobility issues, but can identify with neurodivergence, which is a long list of disabilities in one word. Absolutely. Yep. And he has a vision and has connected with many people at the church recently about helping to serve that population in a better way. Beautiful. And I think it's just helpful to have the conversation when it comes to serving people with disabilities about all of these different needs. The elderly have a lot of needs. People who were born with disabilities have a lot of needs. People like Johnny, who was in a terrible diving accident and became paralyzed as a teenager, have different needs. People with very serious mental health difficulties have different needs. And oftentimes, what we do to accommodate one of these groups actually serves all of them. So I want to continue to keep that very universal mindset. It's universal design prepared to provide for people with all different kinds of needs. So as we go on, 40% of people with disabilities report never having attended a worship service. At the end of the day, this is concerning because Lifeway Research did a survey where they asked pastors, do you feel that your church is welcoming to people with disabilities? And 99% of those pastors surveyed said yes. Meanwhile, 40% of people with disabilities have never attended a single worship service. So there does appear to be something of a gap. The next thing that I want to think about is what we can do about the gap. There is a lot. And we see a great example of it from the story in Mark chapter 2. I see Sandy added a great question. We need advocates. Do you have a special needs advocate in your church? Well, that's definitely something we want to think about as we just are reminded for a moment about some of the things that God has shared in His Word with us about not just the importance of reaching and remembering the poor and the needy, but also how. What we don't want to do is say to people in our churches, you are a welcome guest here. What we want to do is make sure that we are communicating the right message. And that message is we are not complete without you. You're not just a guest, you are missing family. And it is our pleasure to help you come back to where you have belonged all along. Your presence changes us. Your gifts are needed here. We are not whole without you. A few quick reminders that I think will sound very familiar to us all. In 1 Corinthians 12, we hear that the body is literally incomplete and unhealthy without the parts we sometimes overlook. When the suffering are not included, when the poor needy are not remembered, they are called indispensable in the Word of God. But do we act that way? That somehow we are suffering without their presence. In Galatians 2:10, Paul was urged by the apostles in Jerusalem, James, Cephas, and I think John. Um, they said, "Whatever you do, remember the poor." And Paul said, "It's the very thing I was eager to do." Lastly, John chapter 9 blows my mind. I read it again recently, and there's just something about it that hits so hard. I just want to share it one more time. Jesus was walking along and saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, "Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?" "It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins," Jesus answered. "This happened so the power of God could be seen in him." What if there is some power of God that we will never see without the presence of the needy in our churches? We don't want to let that happen. But this is not inexpensive or easy work. So if you're not up for a challenge and some expense, you probably want to go ahead and log off now. You seem to be those that already know this reality, but fighting the good fight of faith takes more than one lone advocate among an entire congregation, as we see in Mark 2. So Mark 2, 1 to 5 says, when he entered Capernaum again after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many people gathered together that there was no more room, not even in the doorway. And he was speaking the word to them. They came to him bringing a paralytic carried by four of them. Since they were not able to bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after digging through it, they lowered the mat on which the paralytic was lying. Seeing their faith, Jesus told the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." This is absolutely remarkable because I don't know about you, but I could not bring my husband on a mat through our house, let alone the streets, let alone up onto a building, let alone through the roof. This takes more than one person, and it's essential that we gather a team at our churches to work together, even if it is a volunteer team. And the key here is the four friends. I believe that creates a model for us in our churches to help us move forward. So, what we want to begin to think about is who are our four friends. These four friends need to have a few characteristics if they are going to last. Number one, we always want to look for people who are convinced, meaning they are convinced that Jesus can heal and love and accommodate and support, but they also have to be convinced that people with disabilities matter as much as everyone else. So we're looking for people who are convinced to be our advocates. Oftentimes, this is people with family members who have disabilities because they've lived it firsthand. But it doesn't have to be. I don't have a disability. The people in my family do not have disabilities. But my heart has always felt drawn toward helping and advocating and supporting however I can. The second quality that I believe is essential for these four friends is that they are clear. Accessibility requires a lot of communication. So these are people who need to be capable of not only noticing barriers, but communicating needs and communicating solutions in a positive way so that people aren't turned off. And I hate to say it, but it's just real life. If things get too negative, um, people shut down. And even if they did have the capacity to help, they lose the will to do so. So, convinced is one quality. Clear and committed is the third important quality. They have to be those that are resilient and able to keep going, even in the midst of setbacks, disappointments, and other difficulties. We're talking about advocates who are leaders and care about the community. One of the things that senior leaders can do that has the biggest impact on the success of their advocates is pray by name for your advocates. This is difficult work, and prayer is one of the greatest strengtheners in existence. Next, what we want to do after we have identified our four friends, and again, if you're still thinking about those names, please do. Maybe this will help. Did anybody from your church ever ask to hold an event like a Night to Shine, which is Tim Tebow's organization that holds proms for young people with disabilities? Maybe someone has asked for earplugs or offered to bring some for the elderly or small children who are struggling with loud sounds at church. Was there somebody who asked where could nursing mothers sit in order to access the sermons while still caring for their little ones? Is there somebody who is good at construction and has offered or could be asked to build a sensory wall in the kids' classroom for kids on the autism spectrum? Maybe you have someone who is a greeter or an usher that would be willing to escort the elderly from the parking lot. And again, we have a ramp that was used to make our Easter egg hunt accessible. And it was offered by a nurse who had never really talked that much to anybody about accessibility ministry. But as a nurse, she encountered people with needs all the time and was uniquely equipped to be able to help in times of need. God is providing for friends, for people with disabilities in our communities. And the question is, are we doing our job as senior leaders in the church to encourage and support those four friends in our churches? What we don't want is to expect one person, the senior leader or one advocate, to take full responsibility for accessibility in their church. But we want to build a culture and a climate of inclusion where everybody is always thinking what can be done to help one more person get a little bit closer to the Lord, a little bit closer in fellowship to the rest of us here. All right, so this is how we start to identify our four friends. And I wanted to share some very specific details about how people at our church have been able to overcome some of the barriers that we already mentioned here in this discussion. This is some accessibility wins for teams. Our production team has a volunteer with an adult child with an intellectual disability, and he's been encouraged to bring his son, who helps him serve by moving equipment on and off the stage. Teamwork makes the dream work in no other way more than serving together with people with disabilities. We know that God has given every single person a measure of the gifts. And so, how can we help people with disabilities identify their gift and use them? In life groups, a person came to our church with limited mobility. Because none of the other life group houses were accessible, she was asked if she would be willing, with support, to host a life group at her own home, which is accessible. And now both typical people as well as those in need of a lift can enter. So we now have an accessible life group. The worship team. We have a part of our worship band who volunteers to play at a local residential home for people with dementia. This is a way of bringing the gospel and the joy of the Lord out of the four walls of the church into places where people with disabilities and other needs desperately are looking for hope and joy and fellowship. Also, long ago, Sunday mornings slides became bigger and much easier to see for people with visual impairments by simply increasing the font of the lyrics for the worship songs that we sing. It does require that you then have more songs, and that person forwarding the slides has to hit the button a few more times, but well worth it. I think we would all agree. The communication team records testimonies to be shared on the stage, either for people who cannot access the stage because we don't currently have a ramp at the stage that's in the facility we rent for our services, or for people with crippling anxiety who are still believing the Lord for healing and struggling to overcome some of those emotional disturbance or disabilities or difficulties that can hold people back from fully participating in their churches. So, video recording testimonies and then sharing them with the congregation on the screen has been a wonderful accessibility measure from our communications team. Also, the website has an accessibility statement, and that is being updated um, regularly because over time, we learn more and more of what people with accessibility needs are looking for from a church. One quick, simple thing to do is jump on your AI. So if you use ChatGPT or if you use Gemini, and you can say, my church's mission statement is XYZ. Write me an accessibility statement in line with that mission to make sure everyone in my community knows that they are welcome and wanted in our church. Um, it's amazing and pretty simple, quick, easy thing to do. Our youth group has a teen with a significant visual impairment. Oftentimes at kids' camps and teenagers' retreats, phones are taken so that they can have this outdoor experience or so that phones are not in the way of relationship building. But young people with visual impairments actually use their devices to help them see programs and slides with lyrics that they're all trying to do a dance to, but they can't read the words. And so, making exceptions when it makes sense for people with disabilities can go a very long way. In our children's ministry, a preteen on the autism spectrum was invited to be a ministry intern and serve with our nursery teachers. So there is supervision, and they are able to use their gifts to help support the little ones. Um, Very often, the little ones don't even know the difference between a lot of people with disabilities and typical people. And so the love and the joy that is shared in that environment is remarkable. David, thank you for that tip. Wireless mics are also very helpful, absolutely. And microphones in general, yep, can be shared 100%. So lots of good ideas here. These are not exhaustive, but they are some things that we've seen work. So I wanted to just share the ideas. The creativity will never end because God's well never runs dry, right? And so we can believe that no matter how many things we've tried, God will continue to give us the ideas we need to help see His kids get back to His church. All right, here's some accessibility wins for individuals. All right, and so you might see this on the slide, but our pastor recently um, decided to start coaching a sports team. And there are many different types of teams. There are typical teams, and there's a unified sports team for players with disabilities. We actually have families that come to church because they have met him through his coaching in our community. And other volunteers can do the same thing. If they're already athletic people and they love sports, it's an amazing way to reach out. And then, as I mentioned earlier, anybody who plays almost any sport can volunteer as a guide on an adaptive sports team. And most communities have these teams. Um, just Google search it up and fill out the application. I've seen adaptive sports guides for skiing, for triathlon, for swimming, for running. They even have specially made bicycles for bicycling. Um, for senior pastors and leaders, here are a couple ideas that have been hugely successful again at our church. One is ask 4 friends to coffee to discuss an accessibility plan. So our pastor has met with me and others to, and this was only recently, provide him with a proposal for next year that includes a plan and a budget and specific names. And so that's exciting because he really is, like you said, Sandy, putting his actions and his money where his mouth is. You can tell he really cares when he says, "Bring me a plan, bring me a budget." Um, and then plan a volunteer training workshop through Beyond Able. So I was able to take the directors of every ministry at our church, as well as some of their top leaders and coaches, through a workshop in training them on how to recognize um, both obvious disabilities and hidden disabilities among people that come to our church, and then how to be proactive and create a plan for each area of ministry so that the worship team is as accessible as possible, the hospitality team is as accessible as possible, the youth ministry, the life groups, the outreach, right? The ways that we can accommodate are endless and can be very unique to individual ministries as well. And it's very empowering to talk to leaders and to train leaders on how they can plan ahead, to be as open and inclusive to as many people as possible on the front end before there's a problem, before there's um, a divisive situation. Uh, Lastly, just for the sake of time, we'll keep going, but leaders can invite a person with disabilities to a personal outing together. So, again, I mentioned the man who is the director of our production team, and he did an amazing job um, bringing his son along for so many of the different activities. But I've encouraged our leaders to invite him and his son out and to really get to know them better on a personal basis, further than what's available on a Sunday morning. Once our leaders have built that kind of established relationship, they are capable um, of understanding and empathizing in a whole new way. So we can set goals, but without a plan, a goal is just a dream, right? No tangible forward motion happens until we have a plan that is communicated to multiple people in the church so that we can work together to make it happen. But don't be discouraged. I've already heard about some of the small steps and large steps that many of you have taken. I love the verse in the scripture that reminds us to not despise the day of small beginnings. We know that God multiplies our faith. Mustard seeds still count, right? Because we know that they grow into much, much more. So I'd like to give you a moment to try a quick practical test. If you want to, you can take out your phone, and what you want to do is go to Google and search accessible churches near me and see if your church comes up. Again, where the rubber meets the road. If your church's name doesn't come up, then what that means is that there is more content that you can add to your website to make sure that people in your community understand that you mean it when you say they are welcome and they will be accommodated for. Search engine optimization is a big term for making sure people can find you when they want you. So what you want to do is think about that. And if you have anybody in your church who runs your website or understands search engine optimization, you want to ask them if they would be willing. Again, buy them lunch, meet for an hour, and they can give you all kinds of strategies for improving the rate at which your website comes up when someone tries to find an accessible church near you. Most churches have already looked at what can we do to make it so that when people say, I'm looking for a church near me, or I'm looking for a Baptist church near me, or I'm looking for a non-denominational Christian church near me, that their name comes up. But what we want to talk about is making sure that we are seen as an accessible church too. Maybe it's sad that we have to say that explicitly, but at the end of the day, if it works, we do it. If it works, we do it, right? Because that's why we're here. I'd like to take a second now to see if anybody has questions that are specific to what we've talked about so far, and put them into the chat.
I really appreciated what you said about a statement, an accessibility statement,
Thank
because
you.
yeah.
I am not a tech expert. And
Hmm.
when our pastor asked me to develop a statement for him for our church, um, I let ChatGPT help me with a lot of it. One,
Right.
you know, it searches the entire internet for language that is
Right.
appealing to people in need of accessibility, and can give us absolutely fantastic wording to use that makes sense. It can also give us tips for how to make our own websites more easily navigated by people with disabilities. Things that we can do for captions for our videos, transcripts for the sermons that we post, meaningful link text so that people who are using an accessible computer can understand what they're seeing. Um,
And I think the key here, though, is that if you do a accessibility statement, you have to work with your leadership to make sure that it's a true, that it is what you're saying it is. It's just the same thing with, I always tell people, if you're background checking your volunteers, then you should have that on your website, because when people are looking for, churches with kids ministry, what is important to them is, are you keeping my kids safe? And so if you're want to be an accessible church, you have to again get these four friends together and really come up with a good starting point. So what would you say? We have churches on here, that are very small. Your church is you know quite large right now. And if you were to think about the typical church here in New England, which is about 50, what would you say the one thing that they should take away from this and maybe work on that?
it really is relationship. Anybody
Okay.
who truly wants to build this ministry needs to be spending time with people with disabilities, and not just family and friends that you already know, but strangers. When you interact with people with disabilities, you come to understand their needs so much better, and it
Yep.
also becomes easier to communicate about those needs with your leadership team. Now, I have
Right.
experienced people having trouble bringing this to their pastor or senior leader and being told, we don't have the budget, that's not important enough. But the reality is, once you have developed a relationship with someone and they meet you at church and they are staring that pastor in the eyeballs and they are saying, it sure would be easier for me if we didn't have to walk around,
Mhm.
or ride around outside to get here, or man, I would love to participate in this event that you talked about today. Unfortunately,
Mm.
that one doesn't have ramp, etc. For better or worse, advocacy is only as strong as the relationship we have with the people in need. So, what
Mhm.
I would recommend is that as you build that relationship and you start to see open windows or doors for bringing forward plans, to become more accessible, give me a call, email me at Beyond Able, and I can help communicate ideas that are appealing to the people who make the financial decisions. At the end of the day, a robust plan that is forward thinking is going to be less expensive than the reactive accommodations that have to happen later when someone sues your church for lack of access, or a bunch of people decide they're not going to come anymore because their new friends and family members can't participate. Right? Nobody
Right.
wants that to happen. And so, just to give you an example of an accessibility statement that I developed for our church, that is based very much on the actual mission statement of our church. Let me just pull it up here for you. And again, this is based on our mission statement, and so
Sure.
it's pretty important that when you look at drafting this statement, you use, like you said, Sandy, something that your leadership has already said, yep, this is what we're about.
Right. Yeah.
Says, at the River Church, we believe everyone is called to worship, serve, and use their gifts, no exceptions. Guided by our mission to love Jesus, build community, and bring joy, we're committed to removing barriers so people with disabilities can fully participate. And then we go on to list, here's what we offer: wheelchair accessible parking and a step free main entrance, accessible restrooms, hearing assistance, and earplugs for those in need, a quiet sensory room for anyone who needs a calmer space during worship, and we have volunteers available to assist with navigation, seating, or materials at any point. So that's
Yeah.
just an example of what really does make a difference between our churches and those who have left accessibility as an afterthought.
Right. So think about, those on the webinar tonight, think about, it's funny. I know of somebody who has a disability, and she reached out to me tonight about getting together for dinner on Friday night. So, and we've had a relationship for a while. So, we need to, as you say, we need to fan the flames of that. And because they're hidden disabilities, hers happens to be narcolepsy. And, it's not an easy disability for her to share or anything like that. But, I've been able to encourage her in that. And so, I would encourage anybody, on this call, think about it, maybe make that bold ask and invite them to come to church. Maybe you just see them casually, and that might be a good thing. If you're not the pastor and you're a lay leader on this call, perhaps, spend some time praying and write something that's not overwhelming to your pastor, and say, hey, I went to this great webinar. I think there's some great ideas, maybe ABC or something like that. So, it's a good place to start, because it can become overwhelming. But I think you've given us, Jackie, some really good foundation to help.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm so happy to help. Please, everyone, email me with any questions you might have. And keep in mind that at Beyond Able, I do offer a free 30-minute consultation to look at your specific needs and offer a customized plan for whatever accessibility activities you might want to start with. So I just wish everybody nothing but the best.
Well, this has really opened up the eyes, I think, for many. So hopefully this won't be the last opportunity we get to have you on, so that we can certainly understand more and more of this. I think it's very helpful. And our churches need to wake up. We need to wake up, right? And be more accessible to everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you want to support our work in New England, you'll find a link in the description.